The new Cold War on China continues to accelerate week by week. Honestly, I wouldn't talk about it so much if I didn't think it was this important. And if there weren't so many developments, we are seeing so much rapid development. Vladimir Lenin famously said that there are decades in which weeks happen, and there are weeks in which decades happen. And right now, we are living through weeks, or at least months, maybe you could say years, in which decades are happening. Change is really rapidly occurring. And the US relationship with China, that has gone on since the 1970s, has really deteriorated extremely quickly. In another stream, in another video, I talked about how dangerous we are, how dangerous this moment is that we're in, how neoconservative operatives, architects of the Iraq War, like John Bolton, are calling for war on China. They're calling China, in the words of neocon John Bolton, an architect of the Iraq War, a threat, an existential threat to the West for this century, an existential threat. Well, Bolton is certainly not the only one. We see a lot of neoconservative forces and people across the US government in both the Republican and the Democratic parties who are really itching for a war with China over Taiwan. And honestly, it has accelerated, it has escalated in the past, not only few weeks, but the past several days, way more quickly than I thought it would. Today is October 7th. In the past few days, it got to a major breaking point where China did military exercises near Taiwan, which is part of China. So that shouldn't be a big deal. But of course, the US and European powers are trying to break away Taiwan from China to turn it into a US and a Western military base. So China did military exercises because Washington and Brussels are becoming very aggressive in trying to recolonize Taiwan. Taiwan was a US military base from the 1950s to the 1970s for over 20 years. Washington stored nuclear weapons in Taiwan right off the coast of China and pointed those nuclear weapons at China, at the mainland, threatening to carry out nuclear war, threatening to nuke millions of Chinese civilians in order to defend their colony, their imperial outpost, their beachhead called Taiwan. For people who don't know the history, Taiwan was the area which is part of China where, after being defeated in the Chinese Civil War, the extreme right-wing forces of the Kuomintang, the KMT, they fled to Taiwan and tried to create their puppet regime backed by the CIA, Juan Guaido style, but the original Juan Guaido was Chiang Kai-shek. And they claimed that they were the real representative of China. They were absurdly represented in the United Nations Security Council, supposedly representing all of China, even though they're a tiny island. And they are part of China, but they're controlled by the People's Republic of China. They're not independent. The US government used Taiwan as a colonial outpost with nuclear weapons threatening to nuke the Chinese mainland. There were nuclear weapons in Taiwan from the mid-1950s to the mid-1970s for 20 years. And Washington wants to go back to that. That is why it is the US that is trying to provoke a war with China over Taiwan to use the excuse to militarily occupy Taiwan, like what the US did to Korea and Japan. It is 2021, and there are still tens of thousands of US troops in Japan and Korea. They have been there in Japan since 1945, since the end of World War II. There are still US troops there, which prevent Japan from being truly independent. Now, I'm not going to pretend like if Japan were truly independent, it would be much better, because Japan was an imperial power before World War II. They committed genocide. It was a fascist regime. And it colonized China and Korea. So even if US troops were to leave Japan, I'm not going to pretend like it's going to be some great country. But it has even less sovereignty than it would have before. Similarly, Korea, which unlike Japan was colonized, Korea was actually colonized by Japan, and Japan committed genocide and sexual trafficking and committed sexual slavery against Korean women and Chinese women. Korea is still military occupied. Since the early 1950s, there are 28,000 US troops, which prevent Korea from having an independent foreign policy. Korea cannot have an independent foreign policy. And the US has weapons, including nuclear weapons, including anti-missile so-called defense systems, which threaten rural communities in Korea that have protested, demanding that the US withdraw its troops, that constantly rape and sexually harass and abuse women, local women, like they also do in Japan and Okinawa, which is occupied by the US military. There's been an epidemic of Japanese women and Korean women sexually assaulted and raped by US soldiers who never face any justice. And they know that, which is why they keep doing it, by the way. So the US wants to do that also to Taiwan. And the US did that for 20 years in the 1950s and the 1970s. And it's Washington that is provoking a crisis over the Taiwan Strait. It is Washington that is constantly sending troops through the Taiwan Strait. It is Washington that has constant military exercises in the region, in the South China Sea and near. It is Washington that has sold tens of billions of dollars of weapons to Taiwan, which, if that's not provocation, what is? It is Washington that is creeping toward recognizing Taiwan as a supposedly independent country, even though in order to normalize relations with China, the US agreed way back in the 70s to recognize the one China policy. There is one China. Taiwan is part of China, and the leadership of China is the People's Republic of China. According to international law, that is legal international law. There's one China. Taiwan is a part of China, a province of China. It is not independent, but we've seen increasingly the United States and the European Union and Australia have been inching toward recognizing Taiwan as an independent country, poking the bear, provoking a conflict with China, provoking a military response from China, because they know that for China, this is a key foreign policy interest, a key national security interest, an actual national security interest of China. They cannot have the US military restoring its military base in its territory right off the coast of the mainland with nuclear weapons constantly facing the mainland, threatening to nuke the mainland as they did in the 1950s and the 60s. China cannot tolerate that. So the US is trying to provoke a crisis and then use it as an excuse to further militarize Taiwan and to turn Taiwan into a colony. Now, for people who don't believe me, say, Ben, you're like always, you're exaggerating. Come on, what's the evidence of this? Well, now I'm going to talk about that evidence. The Wall Street Journal just published an article that confirmed what has been obvious now for months. US troops have been deployed in Taiwan for at least a year. There's a paywall, but a special operations unit and a contingent of Marines have been secretly operating in Taiwan to train military forces there. I want to point out, Taiwan is a province of China. Imagine China sent Chinese troops to a US state, Florida, I don't know, California, and they trained soldiers there for plans to carry out a war against the central government, to carry out a secessionist war. There's a secessionist movement in California. Imagine China was training troops. China had troops in California and was training troops to carry out a war against the central US government in California to start a civil war, to secede from the US government, and to turn California into a separate country. That is what the US is basically doing. That is the most similar scenario. The US is not only encouraging secession politically and diplomatically, which I'll talk about, releasing ridiculous White House statements referring to Taiwan as a so-called democratic ally, speaking of Taiwan as the Biden White House and the Antony Blinken State Department have repeatedly done. They were referring to Taiwan as an independent country. It is not an independent country. Even the US technically has recognized the one China policy. Ironically, it is Joe Biden himself who has been giving these phone calls with Chinese President Xi Jinping that apparently he's been initiating to reassure China that the U.S. is not trying to start a war as part of a good cop, bad cop strategy. The U.S. military is the bad cop. They provoke China. They constantly have warships going through the South China Sea and going through the Taiwan Strait. They constantly are selling billions of dollars of weapons to Taiwan. They constantly are now sending troops for over a year to train Taiwanese separatist forces. Meanwhile, Biden plays good cop. Biden has been doing these phone calls with Chinese President Xi Jinping, clearly lying to his face or to his ear on the phone call, telling Xi Jinping that the U.S. is still committed to the one China policy. How can you still be committed to the one China policy if you are arming Taiwanese separatists, encouraging Taiwanese separatists to secede, and militarily training them? So again, for people to say, "Oh, Ben, once again, you're being so hyperbolic. You say the U.S. wants to turn Taiwan into a colony. Come on, Ben, stop being so hyperbolic." Well, here is a really good tweet from someone who actually lives in China and is a China expert and is a good journalist. This is Ian Goodrum. He tweeted this on October 5th. Just this past weekend, warships from 6 countries entered the South China Sea. Nearly all of them came from the other side of the world, of course, including the United States and also including Britain. Chinese aircraft also briefly entered the so-called Taiwan ADIZ, a so-called air defense zone. Put a pin in that. I'll talk about how absurd that is in a second. He pointed out that this so-called air defense zone is unrecognized by international law because Taiwan is part of China. It is a province of China. And he said, guess which event is trending? Now, I want to point out, look at this map of the so-called Taiwan ADIZ. The map shows that the so-called Taiwan air defense zone, it overlaps with the Chinese mainland. Again, because Taiwan is part of China. It is a province. Mainland China is part of the same People's Republic of China, along with Hong Kong. But we see with propaganda like this whole Taiwan ADIZ thing, we see constant propaganda, as we saw with the color revolution attempt in Hong Kong, backed by Western governments, with the leaders trained and funded by the National Endowment for Democracy and other CIA cutouts and other Western European governments, with billionaire oligarchs in Hong Kong that support the West, that support imperialism, like Jimmy Lai, working with the Trump administration, meeting with John Bolton to try to carry out a secession campaign in Hong Kong. That's exactly what they're doing now in Taiwan. They tried it in Hong Kong. It failed in Hong Kong. Now they're trying it in Taiwan. They're trying to secede. And this brings me to a key example of how, when I say that Taiwan wants to be a Western colony, this is not hyperbole. You can't say, oh, Ben is exaggerating. Here is a quote from the so-called president of Taiwan. Now, I want to point out that Taiwan, again, is not an independent country. It doesn't have a president. Spinning up the article here. Taiwan is part of China. But we've seen in the past few weeks that the government, the local government in Taiwan, has become very outspoken in its use of secessionist rhetoric, more and more hinting that Taiwan is trying to declare independence with US backing. And I think that's one of the main reasons why the US and also the European Union and Britain have been trying to poke the bear and encourage China and create a military conflict over Taiwan in the Taiwan Strait. The US and Europe are trying to provoke a conflict so then they can have an excuse. They can claim that it's Chinese military aggression that they initiated, even though China is the one responding to their aggression. But it will take military action. It's not bluffing. It will take military action to hold on to Taiwan, to prevent it from becoming a Western colony and a U.S. military base with nuclear weapons right off of its shore. So they're trying to poke the bear, encourage a Chinese response to justify recognizing Taiwanese independence. Here is an article that was published by the so-called president of the Chinese province of Taiwan, Tsai Ing-wen. She wrote this article where in Foreign Affairs. Now, for people who don't know, Foreign Affairs is the mouthpiece, the media outlet officially of the elite U.S. regime change organization, longtime CIA front, the Council on Foreign Relations. So where she picked, the media outlet she picked to publish this article is significant politically. It's a sign that she's hinting in this article in which she refers to Taiwan basically as an independent country. She's hinting to foreign policy elites in Washington that Taiwan is on the verge of declaring independence and that she's on board with these Western powers to turn Taiwan into a Western colony. You don't take my opinion for it. Here is what she wrote in that article. Again, this is the so-called president of Taiwan in her article in the Council on Foreign Relations media outlet Foreign Affairs. She referred to Taiwan as, quote, vibrantly democratic and Western. Democratic and Western, yet influenced by a Chinese civilization and shaped by Asian traditions. What the hell? She's referring to Taiwan as a Western country. That is like the biggest sign that you could potentially say. She's like shouting with her arms stretched. We want to be a Western colony. We want to be a Western colony. We are Western. We are not Chinese. We are Western, but influenced by Chinese civilization and shaped by Asian traditions. This is the so-called president of Taiwan in an article in which she basically says we are going to declare independence and become a Western colony in one of the most important magazines, media outlets of Western imperialism, a voice of the DC foreign policy establishment. This is what Americans crucially need to understand, and Europeans. There's so much propaganda claiming that China is supposedly the aggressor. No, you have to understand what's going on here. The US and the European Union and Britain and Australia are trying to create a conflict in the Taiwan Strait to create a war which would then justify the US military occupying Taiwan like it has occupied Japan and Korea for decades, turning Taiwan into a Western colony, as the so-called president of Taiwan admits in her article, because she says Taiwan is Western. And then finally, again, for people who still aren't convinced, I say, Ben, this is all speculation. Where are you getting this all from? This is crazy. All right, fine. You don't believe me? Well, here is the voice of the U.S. foreign policy establishment. Here is the CIA Noise Network, also known as CNN, acknowledging, not decades ago, acknowledging recently. This May, this is an article in CNN titled, U.S. military considered using nuclear weapons against China in 1958 Taiwan Strait crisis. Here's from the CIA news network, CNN. Military planners in Washington pushed for the White House to prepare plans to use nuclear weapons against mainland China during the Taiwan Strait crisis in 1958. Now, how do we know this? These documents were first reported by the New York Times, and they were provided to the New York Times by Daniel Ellsberg, the whistleblower who in 1971 leaked the Pentagon Papers that detailed the U.S. government's duplicity in the Vietnam War, i.e., lies, false flags, and war crimes in Vietnam. So we know this thanks to one of the world's greatest whistleblowers, Daniel Ellsberg. The documents reveal the extent of Washington's discussions about using nuclear weapons to deter a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. No, they say so-called Chinese invasion, including the acceptance by some U.S. military leaders of possible retaliatory nuclear strikes on U.S. bases. Keep in mind what I just read there. U.S. military leaders accepted the possible retaliatory nuclear strikes on U.S. military bases. That is, these psychopaths, the sociopaths in the U.S. military from their base in Taiwan were willing to risk a nuclear exchange, including a Chinese nuclear retaliation that would attack U.S. nationals, kill Americans in order to defend its imperial foothold in Taiwan. Why? Because Taiwan was a U.S. colony. Taiwan was an outpost, a foothold, a beachhead for U.S. imperialism in the Pacific region, right off of the coast of China, with its nukes pointed at China, pointed at the mainland, prepared to exterminate millions of Chinese civilians. That's how dedicated the U.S. government was to keeping its troops in Taiwan and keeping Taiwan as a military base, which, again, I want to stress this point. Taiwan was a U.S. military base from the 1950s to the 1970s. This is not empty speculation. Taiwan was a U.S. colony, a U.S. client regime, and the U.S. wants to go back to turning it once again into a U.S. client regime. For China, this is an existential issue. And that's why, yes, China says that it's willing to use military force to hold on to Taiwan. That's not because China is the aggressor. That's because China is responding to aggression by the United States, to provocation by the United States and the European Union and Britain, who are constantly sending their warships through the Taiwan Strait. And the U.S. has its soldiers in Taiwan training secessionists, preparing to wage a war on China, preparing to turn Taiwan into a Western outpost, a U.S. military base to wage the new Cold War on China. The U.S., in its new Cold War, understands that if it wants to win, it needs to have the capability to threaten China right on its borders. That's why they tried to destabilize and have a color revolution in Hong Kong and install a Western puppet regime in Hong Kong. That's why they're trying to destabilize the Xinjiang region with the Uyghurs and this bogus nonsense, all the media lies and propaganda. And that's why they tried for decades supporting Tibetan secessionists. The CIA, this is public records, public documentation. The Dalai Lama has been a CIA asset for decades. The Tibetan secessionist movement has been supported by the CIA for decades in order to destabilize China, to balkanize China, to support independence movements, and to break up the country to prevent China from being a global power and from being able to govern. Here, once again, is the New York Times. Dalai Lama Group says it got money from CIA, from the Associated Press in 1998. The Dalai Lama's administration acknowledged that it received $1.7 million a year in the 1960s from the Central Intelligence Agency. The money was allocated for so-called resistance movements, that is, violent terrorist secessionist movements. It was spent on training volunteers and paying for guerrilla operations against the central Chinese government. So the CIA was arming and training violent terrorist secessionists to carry out a terrorist war against the Chinese government, to turn Tibet into a big Western colony, like Hong Kong was a British colony and Taiwan was a US colony. Until the 1970s and 80s, they were colonies. And the US has supported Tibetan secessionist forces ever since to break up China. Here's the Associated Press admitting it. The decade-long CIA covert program to support the Tibetan secessionist movement was part of the CIA's worldwide effort to undermine communist governments, particularly in the Soviet Union and China. Also known as Balkanization, like NATO and the CIA did in former Yugoslavia, like they did in the Chechnya region of the Russian Federation to try to support Islamist extremists to break up Russia. This is war by other means. The US is waging war on China. It's already happening. It's hybrid war. It's information war. It's economic war. It's psychological war. It's hybrid war. It's war by other means. And unfortunately, we have to admit that that hybrid war is working in terms of manufacturing consent. The information war is working. Here is a report from the Lester Crown Center on Foreign Policy at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. These are pro-imperialist establishment Western groups, pro-war groups. For first time, half of Americans favored defending Taiwan if China so-called invades. China can't invade. Taiwan is part of China. If violent separatists backed by China launched a terrorist war in California to overthrow the California state government to create an independent government against the US government, and the US military sent forces to China, if China was supporting the secessionists in California, and the US military sent troops to California to quell the violent terrorist uprising, to keep its country together, to prevent secessionism, that would not be called an invasion. That would be called a military deployment to its own region. Taiwan is part of China. It can't invade Taiwan. It's part of China. It's part of China, according to international law, according to the US government itself, which recognizes the one China policy, supposedly. Look at this graph. Look at this graph. In 2014, 2015, only 26% of people in the United States would support sending US troops to China if there was a military conflict in Taiwan to prevent Taiwan secessionists from violently overthrowing the government and creating a new independent puppet regime of the West. Only 26% of Americans supported troop deployment back in 2014, 2015. In 6 or 7 years, that number has doubled. 52% of Americans, supposedly, not that they know what that would even mean, support, that is a slight majority of Americans support sending US troops to Taiwan. That's what all this is about. The US is trying to turn Taiwan into a colony once again, an outpost, and the billionaire-controlled propagandists in the corporate media, the CIA cutouts, the CIA water boys who just regurgitate what the Pentagon and the CIA say in the media, have been trying to manufacture consent for a war, a military conflict in the Taiwan Strait that would lead to Taiwan becoming a colony of the United States that would be militarily occupied by the U.S. military, like Korea and Japan have been ever since the end of the Korean War and World War II. If you told Koreans during the Korean War that in 2021, 70 years after the war, that there would still be U.S. troops, they wouldn't believe you. If you told Japanese nearly 80 years after the end of World War II that the U.S. would still have thousands of troops occupying Japan, they wouldn't believe you. That is what the U.S. wants to do to Taiwan. That's why the U.S. government constantly talks about the so-called Pacific region, the Asia pivot that the Obama administration and the Hillary Clinton State Department began, the Asia pivot, or as Brian Becker often says at the Socialist Program, that is the pivot to war with Asia, the Asia war pivot. The U.S. government constantly talks about the Pacific region or the Indo-Pacific region. The Blinken State Department says that term every week. Or every hour, not every week, every hour says Indo-Pacific, Indo-Pacific, Indo-Pacific. Because they are preparing for war with China. They're already waging hybrid war against China. They're preparing for proxy military conflicts with China, including over Taiwan. That's what they're provoking. And if you don't believe me, here is a neoconservative operative in Washington being flippant about a war. John Noonan, this neocon loser who works for Senator Tom Cotton, one of the most deranged, sociopathic, blood-soaked, bloodthirsty neoconservatives in Washington. He also previously worked for Jeb Bush and Mitt Romney. So he's a neoconservative Republican who worked in the U.S. military. He has a wet dream right here. He said Taiwan is an insurgent's dream. What he really meant to say is that Taiwan is a neocon's wet dream. Dense urban sprawl and mountainous struggle. If they can succeed in distributing their lethality and make cultural changes in their military, they could prove a very tough nut to crack. So, right here, toughest part will be drilling units to shed uniforms and to continue to fight, even if after the government capitulates. It's hard, but would give China one hell of a headache. You have these neocon so-called advisors. This guy advises Tom Cotton in Washington, fantasizing, having wet dreams about a guerrilla war, a proxy guerrilla war against the People's Republic of China in Taiwan, fantasizing about turning Taiwan into a colony. That's what this is about. It's all about the new Cold War. And as in the first Cold War, the second Cold War is not always going to be cold. In the first Cold War, there were a lot of hot wars that were part of the first Cold War. The Korean War, of course, the Vietnam War, the murderous counterinsurgency campaigns like the genocide backed by the CIA in Indonesia, the genocide backed by the CIA in Iraq, the Iraq-Iran War, the invasion of Grenada, the invasion of Panama, the Contra Death Squad War, terrorist war in Central America, Nicaragua, and El Salvador, the bloody, murderous CIA coup operations in Chile, in Iran, in Guatemala, around the world. The first Cold War was extremely hot, was extremely bloody, and the second Cold War is already proving to be quite hot. We're going to see more and more conflicts, and Taiwan is going to be a key locus of conflict, at the heart of that conflict. So if you see propaganda claiming that China is the aggressor, China is going to invade, how could the U.S. invade California? California is to the U.S. as Taiwan is to China. Taiwan is part of China according to international law. It is a province of China. Even the U.S. government recognizes the one China policy, supposedly on paper. Although in reality, we've seen that Lithuania, a NATO and EU colony that doesn't do anything other than what NATO and the US tell it to do. It's a colony of Brussels. Lithuania was testing the waters, dipping its toe in waters, and Lithuania has taken a step trying to recognize Taiwan as an independent country. This is what's happening. This is exactly what the strategy is. So here is foreign policy, the voice of the DC foreign policy establishment, the voice of imperialism. China is bullying Lithuania, foreign policy claims. Bullying. The EU and NATO need to push back, they claim. But what did they say? What happened? Why is China supposedly, in scare quotes, bullying Lithuania? The Baltic country authorized Taiwan to open a representative office in the capital, Vilnius, to be called the Taiwanese Representative Office in Lithuania. And then it announced plans to open a reciprocal office in Taipei by the end of the year. So what's happening is that the EU and the US are using Lithuania as their loyal puppet, their loyal client regime, like they want to turn Taiwan into. They're using it as a test, as a laboratory. They told Lithuania, hey, Lithuania, basically recognize Taiwan as independent, basically allow Taiwan to open an embassy. And that embassy is going to be a trial run, and we're going to see what China's response is. And then we're going to have other EU client regimes do it, and more until we all recognize Taiwan as supposedly an independent country, which is encouraging secession, which is the beginning of their attempt to try to break up China. And China knows that not only is there a threat of having another US military base with nuclear weapons pointed against it kilometers, mere miles off of the mainland coast. That is a major strategic and military threat. But also China knows that if the Taiwanese secession is backed by the US and the EU, if they can succeed in declaring independence successfully and creating a new puppet regime of the West, that will encourage the secessionist forces in Hong Kong. Even though they've been largely defeated, it could encourage them. It will encourage the secessionist forces in Tibet. It will encourage the secessionists in Xinjiang, including the Al-Qaeda-allied Islamist extremists, the Salafi jihadist fanatics. China knows that. And the US knows that China knows that. And China knows that the US knows that China knows that. That's what's happening here. It is about the goal of the US, of NATO, and the European Union is to break up China, to get a strategic chokehold in the region with a military base and with nuclear weapons to threaten China, and then to support other secessionist movements to break up China so the US can maintain the world's global dictator, like it did right after the end of the First Cold War.